The broken vow conscripts in the trenches. Vladimir Putin, the architect of Russia's destiny, made a solemn promise. Conscripts, young men fulfilling their mandatory military service, would not be sent to the Ukrainian front. It was a vow etched in stone, a reassurance to worried mothers and anxious families. Now, that stone lies shattered, the promise broken. Ukrainian forces advance in the Kursk region, ripping away the facade of Russian strength, and there in the trenches stand the conscripts, untrained, ill-equipped, and betrayed. This was not the war they were promised. This was not the special military operation spun by state-controlled media. This was the gruesome reality of the front lines, a reality Putin swore they'd never face. The outcry from Russian families is immediate, raw, and desperate. Social media explodes with frantic messages, pleas for information, and searing indictments of a government that lied. The trust, carefully cultivated by the Kremlin, is crumbling, replaced by fear, outrage, and a chilling realization: no one is safe. The presence of conscripts in Ukraine is an admission. It is an admission that Putin miscalculated, that the superior Russian military is faltering, that the bodies of young men are needed to stem the tide of Ukrainian resistance. The narrative of a swift, decisive operation lies in ruins, alongside the shattered lives of those thrust into a war they never asked for. Ill-equipped and unprepared. The reality on the ground. Reports from the front lines paint a grim picture. Conscripts, many barely old enough to vote, are thrust into battle with inadequate training and outdated equipment. Rusted rifles, lack of basic supplies, a shocking absence of leadership and strategic direction. They are, in the words of one military analyst, lambs led to slaughter. Stories emerge from the digital front lines, whispered truths shared on Telegram channels and encrypted chats. Conscripts deployed to hold the line against a determined enemy are outgunned and outmaneuvered. They lack even the most basic necessities: proper footwear, sufficient ammunition, the life-saving support of experienced officers. "We are being sent to die," writes one conscript in a message shared widely online. No one here knows what they are doing. The historical parallels are chilling. Russia has a long and tragic history of sacrificing its youth on the altar of war. From the trenches of World War I to the killing fields of Afghanistan, the conscript has often been viewed as expendable, a pawn in the grand schemes of the powerful. This disregard for human life, this callous indifference to the plight of the ordinary soldier, is a stain on Russia's soul. A mother's anguish, a nation's shame, captures expose the truth. The truth, however, has a way of slipping past even the most tightly controlled narratives. The capture of Russian soldiers by Ukrainian forces sends shockwaves through Russian society. The images are impossible to ignore. Young men, their faces etched with fear and confusion, paraded before cameras. Their names are released, their families notified. The lie, meticulously constructed by the Kremlin, crumbles in an instant. These are not hardened soldiers, seasoned veterans of foreign conflicts. They are boys, plucked from their homes and thrust onto the front lines. Their mothers, once silent, are now a chorus of grief and rage. Anti-war protests, once easily dispersed, are gaining momentum, fueled by the righteous anger of those who have lost their sons to a lie. The capture of conscripts is not just a military setback, it is a moral crisis for Putin's regime. It exposes the chasm between propaganda and reality, between the Kremlin's carefully curated image of strength and the messy, bloody reality of the battlefield. Each captured conscript is a living indictment of Putin's broken promises, a symbol of the regime's callous disregard for its own people. Dissent and discontent. The domestic backlash. The war in Ukraine was supposed to be a swift victory, a demonstration of Russian might. Instead, it has become a quagmire, dragging Russia into a conflict it cannot win and cannot afford to lose. The domestic consequences are already being felt. Economic sanctions bite, dissent grows louder, and the once unthinkable is now whispered openly. Putin's days are numbered. Opposition figures, long silenced by intimidation and imprisonment, are finding their voices. Alexei Navalny, from his prison cell, denounces the war as a crime and a tragedy. The Anti-War Committee, a coalition of activists and dissidents, organizes protests, demanding an end to the bloodshed. The Kremlin responds with its usual brutality: arrests, beatings, the silencing of independent media. But the seeds of discontent have been sown. The conscription issue is particularly potent. It strikes a deep chord within the Russian psyche, tapping into historical anxieties and fears. Mothers, who have always borne the brunt of Russia's wars, are now a potent political force. Their grief, their anger, their refusal to remain silent poses a direct challenge to Putin's authority. The Kremlin, for now, seems unsure how to respond. A strategic blunder, the military and moral implications. The deployment of conscripts to the front lines is not just a moral failure, it is a strategic blunder of colossal proportions. It reveals a fundamental weakness in the Russian military, a lack of preparedness for a protracted conflict. It also undermines morale within the armed forces, sowing seeds of doubt and discontent where once there was blind obedience. The Russian military, once feared and respected, is now seen as a paper tiger, its reputation tarnished by its performance in Ukraine. The reliance on conscripts, poorly trained and ill-equipped, exposes the hollowness of Putin's claims of military superiority. It also raises serious questions about the future of the conflict. Can Russia sustain a war of attrition, sacrificing its youth on the altar of Putin's ambition? The moral implications are even more profound. The use of conscripts in a war of aggression is a violation of international law and a stain on Russia's conscience. It is a betrayal of the Russian people, who were promised peace and prosperity, not bloodshed and economic ruin. Putin's reckoning, the unraveling of power. The war in Ukraine is a watershed moment in Putin's reign. It has exposed the fragility of his power, the hollowness of his propaganda, and the brutality of the system he has built. The deployment of conscripts, the mounting casualties, the growing economic hardship, and the stifling of dissent all point to a regime under immense strain. The future is uncertain, but one thing is clear: Russia will never be the same. The war in Ukraine has unleashed forces that cannot be easily contained. The seeds of discontent have been sown, and the question is not if they will sprout, but when. Putin, the once unassailable strongman, may find himself facing a reckoning, not from his foreign enemies, but from the people he has so ruthlessly oppressed. The conscripts, sent to die in a foreign land, may yet prove to be the architects of his downfall.